We explored the amount of plastics that were in the human body, looking in cadaver samples of brain, liver, and kidney, and we found higher plastic concentrations in the brain than in other organs, and they seem to be getting worse over time. I was really surprised there was that much plastic in the brain. I sort of went in with the assumption that plastic getting to the brain would be limited, but now we're looking at this data and thinking, okay, they get to the brain and they seem to be getting worse, so maybe there's justification for understanding this a little bit better.
And we are live. Welcome, everybody. My name is Dylan Bohbot, and I'm your host. Today, we have our awesome guest, Dr. Matthew Campen, a professor of pharmaceutical science at the University of New Mexico. Dr. Campen, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
So I wanted to ask you, I know you got a couple of big papers that recently came out along with a couple other things that you've been doing, but I wanted to get a quick introduction, not just for myself, but for the audience about, your life before all this research and before you became a professor even. What led you to this passion that you have for science and what led you to where you are today?
So I'm an environmental toxicologist. I've spent most of my career studying things that you can breathe. So pollutants like particulates and ozone and smoke and exhausts. Um, a lot of that, it's interesting because a lot of that is understanding the toxicity of certain chemicals, but also particles. They're like solid lumps of stuff that you can breathe into your lungs or ingest. And so that's kind of what led us into this world of microplastics. Is it's not so much a chemical as it is a physical particle, and how does that get into our body, and how does it travel, and what does it cause once it's in us has been the sort of new avenue of research for our group.
Mhm. And what got you started? What got you passionate about not just science in general, but wanting to follow this as a career path?
I was fortunate enough to get to do some internships as an undergrad working with the Environmental Protection Agency's scientific wing, the Office of Research and Development.
Nice.
Um, and they really instilled a passion that I didn't appreciate at the time, because I then came back and did my graduate work with them. I went away to do a postdoc for 2 years that was more focused on basic disease and physiology that didn't have that environmental construct around it. And I didn't like it as much. I really did like the idea of studying sort of the pollutants that people can't control in their lives. Cars are driving by and you don't have any control because you live in a urban region and you have to breathe it. And so there's an environmental justice component, I guess, that I felt was sort of a important personal mission, if you will.
Tell me a little bit about this Nature paper that you have.
Sure. So this Nature Medicine paper is titled "Bioaccumulation of Microplastics in Decedent Human Brains," which means essentially cadavers. We explored the amount of plastics that were in the human body, looking in cadaver samples of brain, liver, and kidney, and um, of the findings that were most substantial. I think that we found more higher plastic concentrations in the brain than in other organs, and they seem to be getting worse over time. We looked in samples from 2016 and 2024, and they seem to be going up. The other aspect that was interesting was that the Alzheimer's disease, dementia brains, seem to have higher levels as well than even the normal healthy brains.
So that's, it's concerning, obviously, with the times that we live in, that microplastics, which are such a big thing that has, come to everyone's attention so recently, is the effect that it has on our everyday lives. And now we're seeing post-mortem in people that it really can affect, what's going on in the brain and in your internal systems. But kind of to get to where everything starts, for not just your study, but to see how everything is related to each other. When did microplastics become a topic of interest for not just scientists such as yourself, but the general public, and where do we think they came from?
Sure. So there's a history for the science. It goes back to a paper from 2004 by Richard Thompson in Science, and just basically saying, "Whoa, I see these microplastics in the ocean." And over the last 20 years or so, there's been just a wonderful amount of data showing how widespread plastics are throughout the planet. that has that has piqued a lot of people's interests, and I would say probably 2010 to 2015, you had many more people starting to worry about the environment. But it was only about 5 years ago that somebody first looked at a human organ and said, "Wait a minute, I think these are plastic pellets or plastic particles that are in the human placenta." And so since then, there's kind of been a rush, if you will, of biomedical scientists trying to sort out some of the more important questions, like where do they go in the body? How much is there? What could this be doing for health? So it's really very recent, and with that understood, it's worth noting that there's still a lot of uncertainty in the field, including the findings that we have in our paper.
And you would say, so found in a placenta, that's actually pretty concerning and interesting, but concerning. But speaking about your paper, so please tell us a little bit more about that. What got you started on this topic? How long before you started this paper were you thinking about compiling this research, and what was the most not shocking but concerning thing or interesting thing that you realized from this?
Sure. I mean, my interest in studying these stems from, I guess, that rush of a lot of people jumping in, and they're trying to test whether plastic particles are safe in these, laboratory cell culture models or in rats and mice. And we don't know what the dose in humans is. We're struggling with, are there really, can we really find plastic particles in the brain, in the liver, or wherever? And so that was our interest, was like, let's get a handle on that issue first before we start doing a lot of research studies with doses that we don't understand how to interpret.
Mhm.
Um, as far as the surprising things go, I mean, I think I've been surprised with how complex this is. We're used to studying just chemicals, and these are particles that have some chemistry to them. I've been surprised by, um, how how small these particles seem to be. They're below the level that you can readily detect with a light microscope, unless they're in certain organs, and maybe like collectively agglomerated. So there's a lot of technical details that just we're just at the early stages of discovery still.
Mhm. So actually, I wanted to ask you about that. So what types of materials are you using to discover these, microplastics in organs and brain matter? And, what are the different types of technologies? How do they work?
So we've used, I mean, 4 different techniques in this last paper to say we see these in the brain. The main thing, the highlight, is a technique called pyrolysis gas chromatography and mass spectrometry, and there you're taking advantage of the idea that there's a high combustion point for polymer, and you burn it, essentially, you pyrolyze it, and you look at the gases that are emitted from it, and then you compare that back to a known standard of plastic. So that's sort of the principal thing that we used in this study. The other thing we used is a technique called polarization wave imaging, where you're using a microscope, and if you've got like polarized lenses, you can rotate them and it makes things dark or light.
Yeah.
Well, that kind of refraction of light is something that these little plastic particles will do. And so you can take advantage of that and sort of make them refract light in a certain way. And that's been helpful, just to show us where we think the particles are within the, like, liver or kidney.
Mhm.
Um, and then we used a method called Fourier transform infrared spectroscopy. and FTIR spectroscopy, and that's nice because it gives you a very nice spectra that says this is a polymer. You can pull out um, these particles, but you're not sure whether it's, a little tiny rock. Like, is it a calcium molecule or calcium particle or a silica molecule? So using that spectra lets you say pretty confident that this is polymer and maybe polystyrene or polypropylene or what have you. There's a couple other methods that we use, like Raman spectroscopy and things like that. But it's basically a compilation of things.
Yeah, no, that's a mouthful to say the least. It's quite
Yeah,
a lot.
right. Right.
So if you could go, I guess because this is a show, dedicated to science and how things work, if you could please, because I'm very curious as well, explain the first one with combustion. This is how I'm assuming it works from hearing it from the way you described it to me, is that essentially you have two samples. You have one which you understand the combustion or smoke or burning point, and then the other one is with an object that's not related to that, and you're testing to see how similar they are. Is that correct?
Yeah, yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
Okay.
Um, if you think about, let's say you had a tire fire, right? It's a bunch of rubber, styrene, butadiene rubber is the principal thing there. There's other polymers in there too, but it's emitting like hundreds of different things into the atmosphere when it's combusting. But there are a few gases that are very unique to that. And so we can specifically identify the unique gases and pull them out and then use those to sort of identify and quantify whether it's styrene butadiene rubber or whether it's polypropylene or polyvinyl chloride, for instance.
Mhm. And what would you say is the most common plastic or any sort of pollutant that you're finding inside your samples?
There's kind of a range. I think polyethylene and polyvinyl chloride, polyethylene terephthalate, and of course, polypropylene seem to be highest in concentration, and then nylon. Most of the other things that we've looked at tend not to be in substantial quantities. So we've got the capacity to find polyurethane, polycarbonate, polystyrene, but we really don't see those in measurable levels or
Mhm.
substantial levels.
And what would be the biggest, causes of those things being in the air? Is it from, like an example, you mentioned burning tires earlier, but would cars and trucks on the road and those the rubber on those tires being worn down slowly being emitted into the air, is it pollution from carbon or manufacturing? Is it all of the above?
Our hypothesis at this point is that it's not the fresh plastics, but it's the worn down plastics that have been thrown away. I mean, I think the estimate is that there's more than a ton of plastic waste per person on this earth, and half of that, so 500 pounds of plastic per person, has already been put into landfills or thrown away somehow and is degrading and breaking down. And so as it breaks down, it gets smaller and smaller and smaller. And those plastic, microplastic, nanoplastic, they tend to move through the environment in ways that we don't fully understand.
Mhm.
There are some studies that suggest they have been put, uh, you know, not necessarily purposefully, but they've be through irrigation of crops. We put them onto the soils of the crops. They get back into our food chain that way. Um, so but there's a lot that we just don't have really good quantitative data on. So we're still in a world of uncertainty.
Yeah, still in the earlier stages. I mean, that's fair. It's a newer thing. I mean, plastic as an industry and, you know, became a big global thing, what, relatively recently, by what, the 1960s, I'd say?
Yeah, I mean, they first started pushing this in, like making real breakthroughs in the 50s, and then 60s it became a must-have item for a lot of products, and
Mhm.
and before you know it, essentially the production of plastics has grown exponentially. So every 10 to 15 years, the amount of plastics we create doubles. So that's one of the concerning parts, but it's I always hesitate, and I like to bring people around to the concept that plastics create a lot of benefit to our health and well-being. I work adjacent to this hospital. I have a role with research in the clinical setting, and I don't know how you administer IV drugs without plastic IV lines.
Mhm.
There's a lot of stuff that we do here that I just can't imagine doing without this modern material of plastic. So it's not our perspective that we want to throw this under the bus and say all of this is bad. For the most part, my perspective is I'd like to see it used a little bit more sagaciously, a little bit more thoughtfully, as well as the disposal and waste management needs a serious overhaul.
Yeah, those are all good points. I mean, yeah, the it is a give and take, like most things in life. It has I
Yeah,
mean, plastic is really an amazing concept. I mean, almost everything has plastic in it.
right.
Clothing, building materials, almost everything. But that actually kind of leads to, something I've been thinking about recently and something I've heard a lot of people discuss, whether it be on television, on podcast, YouTube, whatever, is there's, some young people and other companies out there that are really trying to reform plastic technology using um I remember I had these forks, like these wooden forks come in a reusable or like seaweed plastic container. If you know anything about that, that's actually something I think a lot of people would like to hear about how that process works, what are the stages of development in that industry, and how that can lead us forward into revolutionizing plastic in general.
Sure. So, I mean, I'm not really the expert in those products, but it does seem like if we use material that's based on cellulose or some other natural polymer that degrades faster, my point is I want to see these things get back to the carbon cycle. Carbon dioxide, elemental carbon that can be used by microbes and plants and things like that. With a lot of the polyethylene and polystyrene and polypropylene, that could take many decades, if not hundreds of years, to finally break down. The half-lives of these things are really long. And so during that breakdown process, do they become micro and nanoplastics? And does that accumulate? Do we have like super high levels of nanoplastics at that point? Um, it seems like that's the case. And obviously we want to be careful if we're exponentially accumulating some material that has access to the human body.
Yeah, that makes sense. It is scary to think about, because these are things like you said earlier, you saw in your study when you were looking at cadavers and samples, taking samples, and that they were really accumulating in the brain as well as the liver. Um, why do you think they are accumulating in those specific tissues so much? I would like to pretend like I know why, but I really wanted to ask you that question. That's really important.
Yeah. Well, we think they're in all the tissues. We just haven't had a chance to look at everything yet. Um, the brain strikes us as interesting because again, we only really see nano scale things, so less than 500 nanometers in the brain. Um, we think it's partly because of the high metabolism of the brain that's helping to pull these in. We think it's the poor clearance systems in the brain that might allow them to aggregate.
What does that mean? I'm sorry.
So all of our tissues have clearance pathways, like lymphatic pathways, and the reason there is your cells use oxygen and create CO2. They use glucose, but they release, other chemicals that are downstream of the degradation products, and you have to get them out. And ultimately, you breathe out your CO2, or urine or feces, you get rid of other waste products.
Mhm.
But each organ individually has clearance pathways. The brain's is not like super high capacity. It,
Okay.
it it may not handle these plastics as well, and so that might lead to some accumulation. Um, but ultimately, we're not sure if those are playing a role or if something else is going on.
Mhm. Did you do studies on any other types of species other than humans? I know you mentioned earlier that rats and mice have had studies done on them, but I know you said you used cadavers, but is there any way to test this on living people, get living samples off of people's or larger mammals?
So, there are some studies that have looked in blood or urine or, breast milk of people. So those are being done with again, there's still challenges to very accurately read out, the quantities. I mean, there's actually a product out there that they'll do a little finger stick. You drop your blood onto their, little grid, and you send it back in the mail, and they'll count the number of, microplastics that they see. I don't, uh, I I don't advocate for that product. I'm not sure that it has a lot of value since we don't know what clinical what are the clinical implications for having high or low plastic level. I don't know.
Mhm,
But there's studies like that that are being done in live humans. Um, and then yes, we've done mouse studies where we purpose have them eat plastics, and then we can look at the distribution, and we do show that they get to the brain, they get to the liver that way. So we're trying to use all the approaches to inform ourselves the best we can.
mhm. And would you say what would you say is the most concerning aspect of this in your opinion? I mean, you're the one doing all this research and you've recently written this paper and with your colleagues, what discussions do you guys have in private about, these things that you're finding out and discovering?
I mean, I think the biggest concern I have is big plastics become microplastics, and the microplastics become nanoplastics, and from nano, they basically become molecular, and what I don't understand, what I'm not sure there's a lot of data on, is how long particles are going to stay nano. Is it relatively short-lived? Are they just degrading so fast at that point? Or is there really a chance that that size range can accumulate in the environment? Um, part of me thinks that they're just so aged and so brittle and so, easily they should be easily degraded into the molecular basic individual polymers.
Mhm.
So I'm trying not to be too worried about it, but the truth is that there's just no obvious evidence at this point.
Yeah. What do you think we can do to get rid of all this plastic and all this trash that we have? I mean, like, I'm from California. Everybody in California grows up learning about like the Great Pacific Garbage Patch. And I've seen a lot of videos on Instagram or whatever social media of, these guys going to like Thailand or Vietnam or wherever else. And there's these huge beaches that have just been completely polluted or rivers in India. And then they do these cleanup projects. Like, in my opinion, this is my personal opinion. I think if there's a way to capture carbon, the only thing you can really do with all of that is just burn it. Because if you are putting that back into life and everything, as you said, it's going to just degrade and cause more harm to not just us, but crops and wildlife and all of our ecosystems. What do you think is a solution, I guess, to getting rid of it? Because we can't completely divest from plastics. It's become
Right.
such an integral part of our life. But what do you think is the ways that we can really get rid of it? Any benefits to recycling or reusing it in day-to-day life?
So Dylan, I actually really agree with you about the incineration idea. If you look at the UN Plastics Treaty group, they really don't want to see us wholesale invest in incineration, waste to energy treatment plants. And they've got good reasons to say that because what we've seen is that those create sort of an industry and a drive to create waste because now waste is fuel, and they want it to be more prevalent, and they want there to be uh, stronger economic motive. But it can be done right. It can, and I think that given the sort of economic players right now, there's just so much money and political motivation to have polymers created, have plastics created at high levels. Nobody wants to, put caps on production. So, I mean, and I don't want to get too political, but we're currently in this country in an environment that is very anti-regulatory. I don't see there being a lot of opportunity to fight this battle. So if you move towards uh, publicly held waste to energy treatment plants, there's great examples of these all over the planet. Singapore, Vancouver, Copenhagen, they have really effective models. I th
What types of pollution are they? Sorry to cut you off, but I'm very curious because I didn't know that there were such things. Can you like what did can you just tell me a few of the things that they're sort of mitigating? Because is it just plastic or is it other types of pollution as well?
So it's all waste typically. It's
Okay.
probably a mixture and depends on the facility. Um, Plastic is one of the preferred things to burn because it does release a lot of energy relative to, say, food waste.
Okay.
But it's typically a mix of waste. I think Vancouver derives 25% of its power from a waste to energy treatment plant in Burnaby.
Really? That
Um,
much?
yeah,
Wow.
yeah, it can be done at a high level and fairly effectively. We do worry about the pollution that comes out of that, but, compared to coal emissions, it's really quite, it's relatively clean. I think if we invested, we'd have more technologies come along that made it more clean and more efficient as we, improve the transport, to that place, really make things work effectively.
Mhm.
The downside is it might not be a solution for all regions, like, rural communities may still not be able to take advantage of something like that just because the effort to collect things and take them to a common place may simply be too much. So it's not gonna be a one-size-fits-all solution, but I sort of agree with your point that, you know, we just have such a problem on our hands, and it's getting worse, and we're behind the curve, and we might need to just do this for a couple decades at
Mhm.
least.
Yeah, because at that point, it's like this is such a big problem. I mean, what other choice do we really have? You can't just put it in the ground and bury it. And okay, then you're going to just kill the environment 100 years from now. It's going to be a disaster. I would say, yeah, I'm glad that we agree on this thing. You know, whatever the differences of how we would go about with the pollution, or if we can capture whatever gases are being released, kind of like how they try to capture carbon, like how I've heard about some of the things that they're doing with natural gas and how they're capturing, excess pollutants or methane or anything like that. If there's anybody out there listening
Yeah,
who knows how to do this, you
right,
will become a very wealthy man or woman if you invest and create this technology.
right.
Because I think, and that's another good point that you brought up is, there's a lot of people that really would take advantage of seeing a system like that being put in place and just trying to create more plastic and sort of make a circular industry, that feeds into itself. Oh, we create more pollution, but we're the people with the solution, right? Kind of like the mob, just like
Yeah,
silent partners, just completely screwing everybody else over in terms of that aspect. But that actually brings me to something that I wanted to ask you is regarding this whole situation, did you have before you did this study and before you really got into this, topic, did you have any preconceived notions? Did you have anything that you were really curious about that turned out to be wrong? Any hypothesis that you had which was proven to be correct or incorrect?
I was really surprised there was, that much plastic in the brain. Sort of I sort of went in with the assumption that plastic getting to the brain would be limited and, um, I wanted to sort of put some guide ropes on a lot of the studies that were being done on, like, neurons and cell culture, like, "Whoa, those are really high concentrations. We should probably, not try to interpret." But now we're looking at this data and thinking, "Okay, they get to the brain, and they seem to be getting worse, so maybe there's justification for understanding this a little bit better."
Hmm. And what do you think? What do you think is a solution to expunging plastics from the body? I know you said that the brain has a bit of a difficult time getting rid of what was that process you called again? I'm so sorry.
Oh, just the overall clearance through,
Clearance. Okay.
yeah.
Yeah, is there any, I guess this is me being, a bit too optimistic, but is there any sort of materials or something that people can ingest that can help, I guess, collect these sorts of toxins and help your body expunge them, or is that something in development?
Not that I'm aware of. I think that, um, avoiding too many processed foods, limiting meat intake is probably the best thing, and that may help reduce the amount of plastics that you get into your body.
Why meat
Uh,
intake?
why the intake? Because I don't know of any ways to accelerate the removal of it, and I really worry about people using weird additional chemicals to try to get rid of it.
Mhm.
Like it, we're going to use weird chemicals to get rid of a weird chemical. I just feel like
Yeah.
that's the wrong approach. But yeah, the, the meat, I like meat. I'm not walking away from it. But I'm trying to eat less and just have a balanced diet and eat more vegetables that we
Mhm.
think will have less plastic content.
Mhm. And why would there be an elevated plastic content in meat? Is it because of bioaccumulation, kind of like how if you eat too much tuna or swordfish, you have a risk of mercury because they eat so many smaller fish that also feed on smaller portions of mercury-laden things? Is that correct?
Yeah, that's
Okay.
that's the concept. Yeah.
Interesting. Wow, it's weird how everything is so connected like that. Yeah. And I don't know. I'm concerned because here I am in New York with my window open and I don't live right by a street, but it's like welcome in, just particulates of plastic and dust, coming right in. So in somebody's house, like I know you said a couple things that people can do. What are things people can do every day to sort of limit their not just ingestible microplastic exposure, but things like I've heard is using glass Tupperware. Don't reheat things in the microwave in plastic containers. Use a bamboo toothbrush. What are some other things day to day that people might not know or that you think would be useful?
Yeah. Um, those are sort of the classic advice. Those are reasonable, and certainly more more so. Uh, those will be beneficial in terms of limiting exposure to some of the chemicals that are associated with fresh plastics, like
Mhm.
phthalates and bisphenols and PFAS. But I don't know. I think just I come back to this idea that we're still learning how much plastic is inside the body. We still have a lot of uncertainty. Humans still live to be 80 or 90 years old pretty regularly in this country and in most advanced countries. So maybe there's no immediate concern, and maybe we shouldn't be individually panicking.
Okay.
I think there's more opportunity here to talk to our leadership in government and say, we're all collectively worried. We would like to make investments in better regulatory structure around, recycling and waste management and just clean up this country, right?
Yeah, no, I
That
agree. I agree 100%. I mean, regardless if whatever side of the political spectrum that you're on, I think everybody could agree that,
Yeah.
and I've heard people from both sides of the political aisle say this, that we should have clean air, clean water, healthy, national parks and natural spaces and forests and soil and so on. And if you look at some of the changes with like the new administration getting rid of things like dyes and so on in our food. And I think that's a really good step. It's nice to see, governments around the world finally, at least seemingly finally, taking steps into getting rid of, things that we really should not be having in our food supply. But what you said to me at the beginning of the show is that you noticed people that have more microplastics in the brain were people that had dementia and other illnesses. Is that correct?
We did.
Tell me a little bit
Um,
more about that.
and so we have to caution, the disease of dementia is typically one where you have a more open blood-brain barrier, so the blood vessels of the brain typically have very tight control over the things that get passed into the brain compared to other organs. But in this disease, that loosens up, and so things get across that shouldn't. And when we use that polarization wave imaging, we saw what looked like a lot of plastics around the blood vessels, as if they're starting to penetrate more readily compared to healthy individuals. And we also saw the plastics apparently in areas where there were immune cells, inflammatory regions of the brain in the disease. So in no way did we think those plastics are causing the disease. They might simply be there because the disease is a more um,
Mm.
uh, inviting scenario or an easier place for them to get to. So we're really not sure whether that was a um, chicken or egg kind of phenomenon.
Okay, interesting. Because what I thought you were going to say is that the accumulation of plastics in the brain near the veins and blood vessels, I thought you were going to say is that the white blood cells were attacking them as if they were some sort of virus, and that potentially would have been causing inflammation or something like that.
No, I mean, we definitely don't see that in the normal brains. Even even in livers where we think we're seeing lots and lots of these little shards of plastic, we don't see immune cells being activated. So, the bottom line is we insert plastics into our body pretty routinely. We make plastic stents to hold open blood vessels that are diseased and damaged, and we plastic parts for the hip and knee replacements. So there are some concerns that those might shed microplastics and might have some immune response. But the bottom line is most of those um, implants have really, really long lifespans and improve quality of life dramatically for those
Yeah,
individuals.
of course.
So it's hard to imagine that a lot of the plastics that we're visualizing in these tissues without any pathology are causing anything.
It's just such a strange topic to think about. I mean, what are some other projects that you or your team have been working on, or you or any students that you might have worked with, and some things that you might want to let people know about?
So, we're really doing a lot of work around improving our methods in the plastics world. This is as much as this has caused a large global response. Um, it's not a good enough approach to really detailed understand if people are more likely to get disease or not. We just need more refined approach, more precision. So we're working on that a lot. Um, the other area that my lab is very invested in is the concerns around wildfire smoke and neurological health. So we do a lot of work with animal models, and we partner with some epidemiologists to look at the human situation. But there we're seeing that there's a sustained neuro neurological effect, like sort of a depression, if you will, that happens for weeks after the exposure is over, and could be more sustained in older individuals. So we're starting to um, we're going to be communicating a few of those papers soon, but it's obviously important for most of the planet as well.
Sure, yeah, we just had those really catastrophic wildfires in California like less than 2 months ago. That's really fascinating. I know you said that you have your papers and you're preparing things for that, but is there anything more that you can go to in depth in that subject?
Sure, we've published a few things on this.
Okay.
One of the first papers we had this mobile laboratory, um, and it was parked out about an hour west of Albuquerque, but essentially I like to point out it was 1,000 kilometers away from the source of the fire in California.
Mm.
So even though it traveled that far and it was really dilute compared to what Californians were seeing, we were able to show that yes, in the mouse brain, you saw increased like numbers of immune cells moving into the brain, and there were changes in the metabolites, and um, we've done subsequent work here in the lab where we show that there's changes of the animal's behavior that sort of like a depressive outcome. So there's a lot going on there, but again, it's the main thing is that it persists for a long time after the exposures.
For how long?
So in healthy mice, otherwise like normal healthy mice, up to 28 days. So, like long after the exposure is over, and that's what we worry about is if you're, having, trouble getting things done at work, or, you're not in a good mood and it's weeks after the exposure, you might not put those together as, you know what, let's just relax. Maybe this is just uh, you know, sort of a long-term effect from these wood smoke exposures.
That's so
In the older
wild.
Oh yeah. So in the older animals, it lasted like 10 weeks, it was really long.
I
But
mean, wow.
one of the cool things was if you use some supplements or like use nutritional interventions like polyunsaturated fats, you could normalize things. And so that's kind of the gist of those studies is saying, we all face this. We all have these environmental stressors. We get exposed to stuff. But if we're taking care of ourselves, if we're eating a healthy diet, we can get past a lot of that and give ourselves the defenses we need to maintain proper health.
So a young healthy person essentially after experiencing that just due to the was it just because of smoke or other pollutants in the air as well?
Um, I mean, smoke is a lot of the pollutants, but
Oh,
yeah, we just
again, I don't know anything. But
no
so
worries.
so when people are exposed to that, it causes depression like systems or something in that family for almost a month, and then for older individuals up to 10 weeks?
So and keep in mind these are mouse studies, so
Fair point.
some level of caution is needed, but we are starting to look in human cohorts, epidemiological studies to see if we see that. So we're about to um, submit a paper that has that information. It's sort of confirming what we think see in mice.
And you said a diet high in polyunsaturated fats was able to sort of mitigate some of those factors?
Yeah, and it's interesting because when we work with mice, we give them a really healthy diet already.
Mhm.
That's just how we treat the animals in research. Most Americans, or at least a lot of Americans, are starting at a bad diet.
Good point.
Um,
Fair enough.
and so there's a lot of opportunity there to say, "Whoa, okay, I know there's just been a lot of smoke through our area for the last couple of days. Maybe I'm gonna stick to some salads. Maybe I'm gonna get some
Yeah.
healthy soups,
Yeah.
uh, fresh fruit."
But I could see also on their perspective how hard that could be. I mean, like imagine you're living in California, in SoCal, and your family home is gone, and luckily you and your family and your loved ones and your baby pictures survive, and you guys are out of there. But most people aren't going to think the first thing is, oh, I'm going to go and make myself an avocado salad with lemon juice and olive oil, right? um
So
so that's actually like a really interesting thing. I mean, I know diet is connected to everything, but in today's world where people really are trying to, I guess, be more active and healthy, but at a larger scale than before. I'm in my 20s, so I grew up seeing people generally being healthy. But, and this kind of ties back into something I wanted to ask you about when we were talking about the development and industrialization of plastic. Excuse me. Um, I'm not sure how old you are, doctor, but in
pretty
your,
old,
how old?
pretty old.
Pretty old.
I need these things.
But my question is, when you were younger and plastic was becoming more and more of a thing in consumer goods, in food packaging, and so on. Did did people ever question anything? Did people ever think, "Oh, this newer product is now involved in everything we touch in the house"? Do you think that anybody had any sort of concerns or were raising any red flags?
I mean, we worried about the litter we were creating. Even back in the '70s, there's a famous commercial with a uh, you know, Native American on a horse crying at the sight of the waste that we've put on the earth. Um, so I I don't think we were oblivious to the fact that we're starting to create a tremendous amount of junk, but we didn't worry about it for our own health. I don't think that ever crossed anybody's mind. And we became more and more comfortable with the single-use items, with the wrappers um and I don't even know why this became a thing that we have to put, like, a little safety seal around every little cap, you know? Um,
It just doesn't make any sense.
yeah, just so much stuff that became normal, and we've done nothing about it.
Yeah, like for me, I always thought, this could be like a good industry to have. It's like, why don't? I mean, then again, this comes into municipalities and it's harder in larger cities. It's like if you have glass items, like let's say a glass milk container, water bottle, whatever, and you don't need to use those anymore, you have like somewhere in your town or in your block or borough or at whatever, and you can just drop those off, and then a local company can repurpose those. Or if there's a glass manufacturing boom in this country, right? Obviously, there's the issues that come with glass. You have to get sand and labor cost and so on. But being able to do that and sort of create and reinvigorate the industry instead of having single-use plastics, use glass, use recyclable, like the seaweed wrapper that I mentioned earlier, things
Yep.
like that. Do you think that that's feasible? Do you think that's something that Americans or the world in general are more open to hearing about something like that?
I think it is, and the other thing I think can happen is we get back in the mindset of when we had glass bottles, we were paying an extra 10 cents for that bottle, and we would get that 10 cents back when we brought it, back to the store. Um, that's probably not enough to move the needle nowadays because we've made such a culture that says, "Oh, we just throw these things away, and what's 10 cents? It's nothing." But I think if you put a reasonable surcharge, like 25 or 50 cents on these things, and we've got these crazy apps now that make things so easy to get credit for all kinds of weird things. I feel like there's a mechanism that we could simplify this. Coke company, or sorry, any soft drink companies can, uh, incorporate that into their cost structure. I I was thinking about this. I've been flying a lot, and we'll pay stupid amounts for a bottle of soda, like $5, $6 at the store.
At the
When
airport,
you're
man, at the airport, they'll charge you, no
Yeah,
doubt, $12 for a bottle of water. They don't care.
right? So putting an extra 25 or 50 cents into that is not gonna, like, surprise anyone. And if you get that back, all of a sudden there's a economic driver for recycling, and maybe it's not your pay grade. For many affluent people, one percenters, they're never gonna bother. But now there's a more viable economy for, I forget the term, but basically a lot of homeless people can take advantage of that and derive a reasonable income that can keep them, above water.
Yeah, of course, college students too. If you're not doing anything, could you imagine all
Ye
all the empty liquor bottles used as decoration in like frat houses? And I lived with four dudes in college. I know how exactly how it is. All those
Yeah,
bottles is like, dude, you can just recycle those and buy pizza. You can go to the
right.
grocery store and get a couple things and we can make dinner. Like, I
Yeah.
think that would be such a great system. And what, sorry to cut you off, but I thought you said something very, very interesting, is that all of these big companies have, all of this technology and capabilities and resources. And when you said that, I thought, why don't they just make the glass bottles with, how says like Coca-Cola, Pepsi, Snapple, whatever. On the back of that, you can put some sort of like code or scanner, and there's an app. Scan the thing, take it to a center, or you can have some sort of subscription like back in the day.
Yeah.
uh, National Geographic subscription or newspaper comes to your door. Let's say you live in an apartment complex. It can't be that difficult to organize something where they organize everything. I mean, they organize trash pickup, they can organize this, and I think that would be a beautiful system. Everybody benefits from that.
So I mean, we're waiting for innovators, I think.
One last question for you. We like to end this show with one question in particular. What is something that is in your thoughts? What's keeping you up at night? What is something that, motivates you? What is something that you really think about when you're alone, and something that you'd like to share with the audience?
This research keeps me up at night. It's it there's a lot of gaps in our knowledge. What we know and don't know are, uh, there's a lot we need to learn. We need better methods. We need to figure out better processes to capture samples and isolate plastics. And that's it's pretty crazy how much I have to think about this stuff.
Hmm. You see any progress being made in that department at least, or anything in the future coming up, you think?
Um, in a sense, yes. I'm pleased that a lot more people are working on this now, and maybe that's one of the most important outcomes of this paper is that a lot of people are now interested in it. Maybe they'll do it better than we did it, and we'll learn and grow as a sort of field of science as opposed to just one investigator at a time. A lot of people are really passionate about this work and chipping in. It's a great team to work with because everybody's very collaborative and sort of team spirit, team oriented. So that's probably the best aspect of this work is getting to work with a lot of people with different backgrounds and expertise. It's been really enjoyable work.
Dr. Campen, your research is vital and necessary, and thank you for all the work that you do, and thank you for joining us today. I really appreciate it.
Glad to be here, Dylan.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone, for listening.